but I already had a sense of how dire and scarce the media coverage of Palestinians would be.
So think of the thousands of interviews I've produced, but there was one interview that was held with no explanation. I left the CBC in 2019 and I wrote about this incident.
I always think back to the Iraq War, right? I mean, exact same thing happened at that time. There was a real jingoistic, patriotic tone in a lot of the media coverage that took place then, and I see I see the same thing playing out now.
And I also think the weaponization of anti Semitism has made people very afraid to speak up for Palestinian rights because there has been a misapplication of what anti Semitism is.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Ahmed Ramadan for Muslim Network TV, and this is GTA Muslims Today. We're sitting here with a couple of contributors to a new book that has just been released called When Genocide Wasn't News. Besant, Shenaz, thank you so much for joining us. Starting with the first question here, how did you get involved with the making of the and writing of this book?
So the my contribution to the book was an article that I wrote for JSource, which is a news outlet specifically for the journalism education community, and it started immediately after October 7th. I already knew what the repercussions would be like, well, for Palestinians on the ground, but I already had a sense of how dire and scarce the media coverage of Palestinians would be in Canadian media. And so I decided to start documenting and recording everything I was watching and listening to in terms of the perspectives that were missing and what I perceived at that time to be sheer censorship of certain perspectives being reflected in the media. And it started from there. I started documenting, and very quickly I realized that, it was only, what I had anticipated was definitely happening, was coming true, and it was only getting worse as time went along.
It started for me because I worked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, for 10 years. And the one interview of mine in 10 years that didn't air was an interview with a Palestinian. So think of the thousands of interviews I've produced, but there was one interview that was held with no explanation. I left the CBC in 2019 and I wrote about this incident. And since then, I've been doing independent journalism. And over the last 2 years, I've specifically been writing about the Palestine exception. So the contribution that I have in the book was actually an essay that is about the fact that we are not supporting our Palestinian journalist colleagues, that we can't talk about Palestine in Canadian media, and that we have to find the courage to talk about press freedom in Canada. And part of it is also just me writing this essay was also about me trying to undo the self-censorship that a lot of journalists have. We can blame everyone, but it starts with you having the courage to talk about it. So my contribution to the book is an essay called Covering Palestine Shouldn't Cost You Your Job or Your Life. It's a tribute to Palestinian journalists and an attempt to undo the censorship that we have on Palestine in Canadian media.
So I'll start with you with this question. Could you have fathomed, because I know back in 2019, even before, virtually October 2023, things started to change. But before that time, there was almost no movement at all on the Palestine issue. I know a lot of activists that were involved with Palestine and other issues, and they would say that there is no movement on Palestine. Could you have foreseen the kind of movements that have now come up because of the waking up of the people?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that question from a media perspective, having worked full time as a journalist across three different newsrooms: Al Jazeera English, BBC, and CBC News, over 10 years, and then starting to teach journalism to students in Canada, to post secondary students in Canada. I mean, when we say that there was no coverage or no coverage of Palestine, or the lack of Palestinian perspectives before October 7th, 2023, I would agree with that for the most part. But I can say that there was a very, very good long form article that was published 2 years before October 7th, 2023, that was called the CBC Palestine Exception. That was written for Toronto Metropolitan Schools, the School of Journalism within Toronto Metropolitan University, by a postgraduate student. It was an article that I edited and worked really closely with her on. She was a Palestinian student. And if you read that article, everything that you come across in this book today, she actually documented it and noticed it, and, and got comment from mainstream executive producers in that article. So the thing is, we've been talking about the Palestine exception in mainstream Canadian newsrooms for a really we've known about it. When I say we, I mean journalists internally. And Pacinthe, you just mentioned that this all stemmed from her experience covering Palestinian issues and other issues at the CBC. That was a while ago. It wasn't recently. And I once worked for the CBC too. I never worked directly on Palestinian related issues, but I can definitely relate to a lot of what she's saying. I mean, it resonates deeply. And if you talk to CBC and other mainstream news employees today, they may not be able to speak publicly about it, but I'm telling you, a lot of people internally can relate very much to the type of biases and censorship and suppression that we're talking about.
Why do you think that more journalists have not? Although you're saying that many of them are aware of this, and there is sort of that Palestinian censorship. Even people, other than like journalists or working in the media, if you're online and you're doing videos on Palestine, or there is still a sort of censorship that people self-censor on social media. So why do you think more people have not stood up against that, seeing kind of the injustice and being aware of that?
I think it's a mix of things. I think, honestly, Western audiences in general do not know the reality of what's happening in occupied Palestine because the media ecosystem has not equipped them to understand it, to understand the context, to understand the history, to understand that it didn't start on October 7th. Many people, frankly, don't know because their media has not served them. I grew up in Saudi Arabia and Dubai. Palestine was on the news all the time. You know what I mean? It wasn't verboten to say Palestine. And then I came here and I realized there's like something's wrong here. So part of it is a lack of knowledge. I think the other part is that we've seen very clearly that when you talk about Palestine, you are at risk of losing your job, your degree could be withheld from you in the cases of university students in the U.S. speaking about Palestine in their graduation speeches and having their diplomas withheld. There is a cost to speaking out about it. And I think that chill has been very, very effective. And I also think the weaponization of anti Semitism has made people very afraid to speak up for Palestinian rights because there has been a misapplication of what anti Semitism is. And some people believe that just to care about Palestine is inherently anti Semitic. So I think all of those things together has made it so that, people are afraid to speak out about it. But it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot. The dam is kind of coming down. The fear is coming down, but it's only because of the proportion of the carnage and devastation. Any optimism I have about this is like countered by it had to get this bad for people to get it. But a lot of it is an awakening, and I think Palestinian journalists on the ground have done incredible work in showing us the realities and circumventing mainstream media organizations that would not show that.
Just going with what you said, we know a lot of reports have come out, for instance, from the BBC and how they're directing a lot of their journalists, or the New York Times telling them to avoid using words like apartheid. So we've seen some of that direction that's come in the media, but like you said, that dam has kind of broken. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance that the media plays when shaping like a genocide like this, or conflicts, or stories, and why it's not just them taking information, regurgitating it, but actually shaping narratives?
Oh, yeah. I love to talk about this with my students, the power of media in shaping news narratives. I mean, it really can't be underestimated. You know, when we think about news coverage, especially of Muslims, let's say, I think a lot of when I think about some of my Muslim students, they say that they enter journalism programs in order to counter the negative perception and stereotyping that were placed on Muslims after 9/11. So that was a pivotal moment that they remember and that they are doing something about through like, through studying in these programs. I think for me personally, it was the Iraq War that played a big role for me, because when we talk about suppression of perspectives today and censorship, I always think back to the Iraq War, right? I mean, the exact same thing happened at that time. There was a real jingoistic, patriotic tone in a lot of the media coverage that took place then, and I see I see the same thing playing out now, right? Especially, I mean, except it's towards the Israeli government. But I think the difference is that like news executives today are not coming around to the fact that they are still acting as stenographers, or that they are acting as stenographers at all. I think with the Iraq War, a lot of people realized, and when I say a lot of people, I mean like senior executive producers of newsrooms at like CNN and New York Times. The New York Times actually published an apology for their coverage, I think a year or two, maybe 2 years after the Iraq War in 2003. There's nothing, it's hard to imagine anything like that happening today, because we haven't even reached that basic level of that grasp of understanding and acknowledgement by news editors that there's something really sinister happening right now, right? And all of that is documented in this book. So, yeah, I mean, we can only hope, I think, that our voices in books like this, in anthologies like this, and in news coverage like the pieces we put together are heard and are, acted upon.
Guys, thank you so much. Make sure you pick up the book, When Genocide Wasn't News. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.